Whittier wide right. Big pursuit by New York. Stevenson running for his life, throwing to the safety valve. Lamb up the middle of the 40, on his feet, the 35. Dumped on the 32-yard line of the New York Stars. James Sims from the secondary, a 14-yard pickup and a first down with 39 seconds remaining. And this crowd of 60,000 really trying to help the Jacksonville Sharks keep it rolling, because it is a partisan crowd, of course. 28 seconds now, first down. Stevenson for the sideline, stopping the clock. Edgar Scott, the intended receiver. Wendell Wilson covering, gave him a pretty good pop on the sideline. That'll stop the clock with 22 seconds remaining in the first half. If you're thinking field goal, remember, the goalpost is at the back of the end zone now. It's 10 yards longer than it used to be. 22 seconds remaining here in the Gator Bowl. The Stars 7 and the Sharks 7 on our WFL Game of the Week, sent to you across the country on TBS, America's #1 independent television network. I'm Merle Herman with Alex Hawkins and George Plimpton here in the Gator Bowl. Second down.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's do this, everybody. How's it going? My name's Tim Hanlon, and let's get the fun and frivolity underway for this week, shall we? It's Good Seats Still Available, of course, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And when we last left you, we had just begun a very colorful conversation with author Mark Speck, arguably the dean of World Football League authors. Yes, the World Football League of 1974/75. Actually, and as we know by now, actually really was two leagues with the same name, the 1974 version and the very much reconstituted 1975 version. I think as people look back and as the years pile on, the WFL is looked upon as sort of a one-shot deal that ran over 2 years. Of course, we all know that collectively it only lasted basically a season and a half. But as we dig deeper, we start to learn that indeed there were sort of two incarnations of this league. That just to show the just an incredible amount of dysfunction and bad luck and other things in between that beset this league. Mark Speck is our guest again this week, and he is the author of 3, count 'em, books on the WFL, with a 4th one on the way. We'll talk about some of those in the rest of our conversation, our part 2. But as a reminder, those books are the World Football League Encyclopedia, his book that he co-authored with Todd Mayer. The book about the Florida Blazers, one of the teams of the WFL, called And a Dollar Short. And then the book that is probably the primer, I guess, for the casual sports fan who doesn't even believe that this league actually existed for its short period of time, is called WIFFLE, the wild and zany, sometimes hilariously true story of the World Football League. All those books are published by our friends at St. Johann Press. And we're going to just get right back into it. Give us a couple of seconds to knock out a couple of promo items, and we'll get to our chat, shall we? Fantastic. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. I can't think of a more apt sponsor for this week's episode, and that's the place where you're going to find a bunch of WFL, World Football League items for purchase. All kinds of memorabilia there from all kinds of leagues and teams. At SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, use the promo code GOODSEATS and get 15% off your purchases. Do that now. Do that early. Do that often. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS. Why not get 15% off your purchases? Thank you to Dean Mitchell, proprietor of our friends at SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. And don't forget your free audiobook download and 1 month of the Audible service. There's 180,000 titles. Just think about that for a second. 180,000 books to choose from. How can you not find one title to listen to and enjoy a free trial of such? Do it now, please. audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to do it. audibletrial.com/goodseats. You can cancel at any time. And again, you're going to get a free audiobook download to enjoy, to understand the magic that is an audiobook, and also enjoy the free service for a month and get a taste of all the various treasures that await you at Audible, the amazing audiobook service. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Please, by all means, give it a try. We appreciate your doing so. Okay, part 2 of our wild and wacky conversation with author Mark Speck as we continue our journey, our discovery, our investigation, our unearthing of stories from the old World Football League. Coming up, please enjoy. You mentioned Christopher Hemmeter. Hemmeter, is that how you say it? Hemmeter?
Yep.
So he was the owner of the Hawaiians, and he essentially steps in for Davidson, literally in the sort of the last third, I guess, of the remaining season. Why him? Who is he? And how does the league sort of limp through the rest of the season? Because it does seem, though, despite all of this stuff, right, which is just gigantically cataclysmic. I mean, in retrospect, it seemed like the quality of play, albeit not at the level of the NFL ever really, was still not bad and quite competitive and still a pretty interesting product on the field.
Oh yeah, I mean, and especially after they were once the NFL started back in again, had training camp, and they had all the cuts from the NFL. They got a lot of very good players toward the end of the season. Their level of play went up, and it did go up. A lot of, NFL players that had been cut by the NFL and went to the WFL and played there. Once Davidson got out, they needed somebody who was a very good businessman. Hemmeter kind of filled that bill because even though the Hawaiians didn't do well at the gate, they really didn't lose that much money. So they thought, this guy's got to know something. And so they put him in as the commissioner toward the end of 74. Again, like you said, the level of play was maintained, even though the crowds may not have been there. But with this infusion of NFL players, a little bit bigger names, a little bit more well-known, that really helped the WFL toward the end of the season, with players coming in that, they didn't have at the beginning, where it was more kind of unknown guys and minor leaguers and that kind of thing. And they did get these NFL players. That did help them toward the end of the season there. And, they did have an issue there when the playoffs were going to start. They didn't know what kind of a playoff format to have. They went through about 3 or 4. They were going to have it was going to be 2 of the division winners, and we're going to play, and they were going to play one of the other teams, and then they were going to just say, hey, let's the heck with it. Memphis finished with the best record. Let's just give them the championship, not have any playoffs. Then they had 4 teams. They had 8 teams. They had 2 teams. They couldn't make up their minds for. Again, this got in the paper. They couldn't make up their minds for a few days there, and they finally settled on the format that they wound up with, which was the 3 division winners and the second place team, which was Birmingham in the Central, and Hawaiians wound up in there. They didn't wind up in the playoffs, and they were going to have Charlotte, but they couldn't. I think they were going to draw something like 1,000 people if they played there, so they picked Philadelphia over Charlotte, even though Philadelphia finished with a worse record than Charlotte did. So again, it was just kind of convoluted. They did the best they could. Florida beat Philadelphia in the first round, and Hawaiians beat Southern California. And then it turned out that then Birmingham beat the Hawaiians, and Florida upset Memphis, and it wound up being Florida and Birmingham in the World Bowl. And it was a great game because Birmingham jumped out to a 22-0 lead end of the third quarter, and everybody thought it was over. And the Blazers scored like 21 points, just came up a point short. And so, yeah, the level of play was still there. The playoff games, for the most part, were pretty close. They weren't blowouts. They weren't boring. So, yeah, because of this infusion of a lot of talent, Randy Johnson was a Giants quarterback who had been cut. He went to the Hawaiians and really picked up their level of play there at quarterback. Pete Beathard went to Portland. They won. They were like 0-7 or were 0-8, and then they wound up winning almost all the rest of their games and almost made the playoffs because they added Beathard, and Ben Davidson actually wound up playing with them from the Raiders. And a lot of these guys that came in from the NFL really did help the level of play down the end of the season.
Yeah, that's interesting that the cast-offs, shall we say, of the training camps from the NFL and the players that sort of came out of that. It's almost like a transfusion or an infusion of life, shall we say, in the midst of the season. So that's interesting. That's probably a little-known sort of fact as to sort of at least how the quality of play. But you mentioned the World Bowl, right, which was the original idea, is to have a sort of a championship game in a neutral site. I think Jacksonville was originally chosen as going to be the site of the World Bowl, but of course, with the team no longer in the mix by the end of the season, that could not happen, of course. So I guess what you were saying is that playoff, the questioning around how the playoffs would be formatted, I guess, was almost a real-time reassessment, given the fact that you had a couple of franchises that had moved and two teams that had not even made it to the end of the season. But that cacophony certainly couldn't have helped the confidence of the coaching and the players. But even the World Bowl itself, right? Another microcosm event, I guess, of the entire league extravaganza writ large. Even the World Bowl could not escape the issues behind the scenes off the field, now could it?
No, not at all. I mean, it was at Birmingham, which again had led the league in attendance. They figured, well, yeah, the Americans are playing in it, but let's have it in a city that's going to support it. And sure enough, they did. But it wound up that they had actually papered the house there. It was, I think they announced it was like high 30,000s, and it turned out it was like 20-some thousand. So, and most of those people sat up in the cheap seats. So they didn't really, make as much money as they thought. The game itself was pretty good. Like I said, the Blazers almost came back to win, but then when the bell, the whistle sounded at the end of the game, the Blazers were so ticked off because they had lost and they had not been paid in like 5 months. I think it was Billy Hayes, the defensive back, ran in, grabbed the ball, took off with it, and all the players are chasing him because the Birmingham wants the game ball. Billy Hayes runs down the field. His players are like blocking for him. It's almost like a kick return. His teammates are blocking for him, trying to get him into the locker room before they can hit the game ball. And they, sure enough, I think they wound up with it, and they gave it to Pardee because the great coaching job that is mentioned in my book is that he just kept his team together despite the fact that they lost, and lost so much money and didn't get paid. Managed to keep the team together. So you had that going on. And then while the Americans are undressing and celebrating their championship, the sheriff's deputies are coming in and taking their uniforms and then repossessing them because they owed money on them. So guys are throwing their helmets and uniforms out to their wives out the windows before the IRS guys can get there, and they're throwing them out there so they can try to keep them. So they're throwing out their helmets and their jerseys and stuff out to their wives and their families outside. Here, take this before this guy comes and gets it. So it was a comical scene, and again, another story that is a part of the lore of the WFL.
Yeah, I mean, it's my understanding that the game in Birmingham was questionable and whether it was going to be to actually take place because the Birmingham American franchise, I think, had owed something in excess of $200,000 in back federal taxes. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think the IRS, I don't know, can you imagine the negotiations or who has these conversations, right? The IRS allows the game to be played if they could share the gate receipts. You could not imagine a more comical and crazy scenario to allow a championship football game to be played, when you're negotiating with the IRS. To come up with a payment scheme, shall we say, to satisfy old debts. It's incredible.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, they had to get part of it. They got most of it. I don't think, I think, I don't know how much the Blazers wound up. On the top of my head, it wasn't very much that they wound up getting from the game. It was just a pittance, really. And another thing was that why the game wasn't gonna happen was because Birmingham, the players went on strike the week before the game because they hadn't been paid. Because of Putnam signing all these extravagant signing bonuses to these NFL players for these future contracts to people like Kenny Stabler and L.C. Greenwood, that the team had no money. So they went on strike. They weren't going to play. And then Putnam promised them rings. If you go and play, we'll give you a championship ring. And I think that took about 20 years for the players to finally get those. I think they've got them in around 1994 or something like that. It took that long to get the rings, but that's how he placated the players to get them to play. There was all kind of background stories to the World Bowl itself, even right up to the end. The WFL just could not escape these comical, weird, wonderful, wacky stories that had haunted them since they started.
All right, so what did the post-mortem look like after this amazing and ultimately disastrous season? What was sort of the wreckage, and what did Hemmeter kind of inherit, so to speak, and what was his plan to sort of maybe, hopefully, possibly turn it around for another season?
Well, at first, there's a lot of the talk was that they weren't going to have a second season. They just weren't going to try it. They wound up not getting as much money from TBS as they had hoped. I think they got about half the money that they had been promised because they just didn't sell toward the end of the season because the ratings had dropped. It wound up Portland had one employee at the end of the year, and that was Ron Mix, who was the general manager. He was the only employee left, and they really didn't have a team. So a lot of the teams just folded, went by the wayside. Bassett, again, one of the owners that kept his team together. It wasn't until early the next spring that Hemmeter come out and some of the owners said, "Hey, what are we going to do? We're going to give it another shot. Let's give it another shot." They decided to. They started looking for owners. Again, I think they did a little bit better job of looking for owners. They had the famous Hemmeter plan where, players got a part of the gate. If the gate was bigger, they got more money. Now the players, some of them kind of resented that because, you had guys like Zonka kicking Warfield who are bound to their big contracts and they're getting bigger money. So, there was a little bit, not a whole lot, but, it wasn't until, early in the spring of '75 that they said, well, let's give it a shot. They went around looking for owners. Of course, Florida had gone by the wayside. New York was gone. Charlotte was still hanging in there. Upton Bell said, let's give it another try. Chicago, Ryder had enough after the season. He was gone. They were looking for owners there. Southern California, I guess Sam Battistone, who had actually owned Hawaiians, moved into Southern California and went there. Shreveport stayed in. But again, that's a small franchise. They tried again with Jacksonville with new owners. They tried to rebuild it again in '75. They had Zonka kicking Warfield coming in. They had some other guys that were from '75. Darryl Lamonic had signed with Southern California. They didn't hold a draft for college players. They didn't hold one at all. I'm never sure why. I guess they just weren't organized enough at the time to have a draft. But somehow Southern California did get Anthony Davis from USC. He was a great find, and was a great addition for the Sun. They also got Pat Hayden, who was a quarterback at USC because, that he was such a low draft pick in the NFL, and they offered him more money with Southern California. So they did get some infusion of new talent. But with some of the guys they had signed to future contracts and some of the rookies that came in, the owners seemed to have a better plan. They were a little bit better checked. They had money. John Basacco in Philadelphia had very deep pockets, even though he was playing now in Franklin Field and didn't get the crowds because, again, it was just kind of leftovers from '74. And I think they had to deal with the stigma of trying to battle that leftovers of '74. A lot of people still didn't think that they were a major league, a viable product in the market with the NFL. And I think that really hurt them going into '75, even though they did have a better plan.
So it's interesting. I think a lot of people today sort of don't recognize that really the World Football League of 1975 was not only dramatically different because of the efforts of the Hemmeter plan than its its forerunner in the season prior. It also feels to me that I think actually legally too, it was literally a completely separate league, yet it kept the same name. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. It was called the New League Incorporated. And they said, no, this is completely separate from the WFL of 1974. We don't acknowledge their debts or anything. This is a completely new entity. We don't recognize that, even though they did have those stats from the 74 in their media guide. They said this is a completely new thing. So they tried to go it that way. People just, unfortunately, just did not buy it. They just didn't say, no, okay, yeah, all right, it's the same old thing. Even though they tried, and again, I think they did a better job in 75, and I think if maybe if Hemmead or somebody like him would have been in charge in 74, things might have been better. I don't know. It's just speculation on my part, but, having some kind of a plan in place, whereas I don't know if Davidson really had much of a plan, it did help. They did make it through, I think, 13 weeks of the 75 season before it finally, some of the teams wanted to keep going, some of the teams didn't. Some of them just said, we've had it, let's give up the ghost. But some of the teams like San Antonio still wanted to play. Their owner was a fairly good owner. He was well known in the community, a very good civic leader, Norman Beeman, a very good guy, ran the team well, but they were going against the idea that the San Antonio Toros, who had been a minor league team there for years and had been very successful, and the local fans loved them, and now they had kind of driven them out of the city, and now this new carpetbagging team had come in. They were kind of the remnants of the Florida Blazers and an expansion team, basically, and I think a lot of the fans there resented it. Their crowds never really matched what they should have and what the Toros had done for years before that, because they kind of had adopted them, and now it's like, oh, well, you guys are in here now. What are you going to do for us? And they kind of resented the fact that the Toros, who were beloved in San Antonio, were now out, and now you had this new team, and then they had some legal problems with the owner of the Toros filing suit against the owners of the Wings. And he had all that going on in the background. I mean, he had a good team that won all their home games and lost all their road games. So they finished like 7-6. But they're an exciting team. They had Johnny Walton at quarterback, who was very good. And, you had some teams that still were good. Memphis, again, had a good team, even though Zonka, Kick, and Warfield really didn't make much of a difference because they were really targets, for the other players who kind of, again, resented that. Dave Roller was known that he tackled Kick real hard in one of the games and laid a good hit on him and got up and said, "Welcome to the WFL." And, so they didn't really make much of a difference with Memphis as they could have. Memphis did have Danny White at quarterback, so he was a big help. Again, he had been, drafted by the Cowboys, but decided to play for the Memphis team. Hawaiians, they did get Aloha Stadium built in time for, I think I asked the first couple of games in 75, but they couldn't still really sell that many tickets, and they weren't doing very well. But it was just really fighting that stigma of 74. Even though the product seemed to be better, it was better run. They just could not overcome that idea of that lack of credibility from 1974.
Yeah, and you mentioned Memphis, obviously probably the strongest of both years. Frankly, one of the only teams that actually had the same ownership through both of those 2 years, right? So, again, going back to Bassett and team, and actually there's a sort of a classic Sports Illustrated cover in late July of 75 that had, Zonka and Kick and Warfield on the cover. So it's not like national sports media wasn't paying attention to round two of this thing, but obviously, 75, didn't nearly even last the full season. But maybe one interesting little story in the 75 season was maybe, I want to call it the nail in the coffin, even before that season even started, but is the story of the Chicago Winds, the new team in Chicago to replace the Fire. And its pursuit of a legendary NFL player that I think if that were to be achieved was actually going to be the key to getting a television contract for 75, and obviously it didn't happen. You want to spend a couple of seconds on that sort of pursuit? Oh
yeah, I mean that was the big thing. I mean TBS really was kind of on the fence about whether they were interested in having a second season. The ratings had not been good. They had not made the profits they had in 74, that they wanted to in 74. And now they were asked to, be in there again. And they thought, I don't know. We don't know if we want to tackle it. So Chicago went after Namath. Joe Namath was in a big way. They had a new owner, Eugene Polano, who was a jeweler in New York, or in Chicago, excuse me. They hired Babe Pirelli to be the coach because Babe was an old teammate of Joe. They thought that would help recruit him. They changed the colors of the uniforms from red and black and white to green and white, like the Jets. So, they were doing all this stuff. They did have they almost had a contract signed. That everything was agreeable. Namath was agreeable to it. And then at the end, they said Namath wanted 18% of the TV revenues, 18%. Well, they said, geez, you can't have 18%, but you'd much rather have or you're going to have 82% of a TV contract or no contract. So Chicago really wasn't thinking ahead, in my opinion, and should have taken that and said, hey, yeah, we'll take 82%. We got to have Joe. He's going to sell tickets. He's going to put seats in the fannies in the seats, and really help our franchise by having Joe here. And we're going to have a TV contract again. So, but they didn't really think ahead. They said, no, that's it. That's a deal breaker. We're not going to sign you. So Joe stayed with New York and Chicago. They also went after Walter Payton, and they almost got him. They were trying to get him, but he wound up signing with the Bears. They did try to get him. I can't imagine a team with Namath and Payton and then John Gilliam at wide receiver. I think they might have done fairly well. They at least lasted longer than the 4 games they did before they folded. But, again, you're not using a lot of foresight to say, okay, Namath wants part of the TV money, fine. We still got the largest portion of it, and we've got a TV contract. Now we don't have one. So, again, some of the business decisions were a little bit questionable, and that was probably one of them. If they had signed him and said, yeah, sure, we'll give you 18% and we'll go ahead and start the season. But, they didn't. They said, no, that's it. We're not going to sign you. And then the TBS said, no, they backed out. They said, no, we're not going to have you. If you don't have Joe, we don't want to have you. So that was a pretty bad happening there when they couldn't get Joe. I think that kind of was a big loss because they didn't have New York anymore. They had Chicago, would have been the biggest market, and then once it folded, then you're playing in markets like Shreveport, Charlotte, like that. There were smaller markets that at the time were not like they are now. San Antonio's got the NBA team, and Charlotte's got the Carolina Panthers. And, but at the time, these were looked at, especially in the South, they were looked at as smaller markets. San Antonio, and a lot of these were smaller markets that people, really weren't interested. They wanted the big league cities. They wanted New York, Chicago. They didn't have Detroit anymore. Philadelphia was just kind of there. So, yeah, it was really a tough transition from 75, even though they had a good plan in place. Because of the fact they didn't get Namath, I think that was really a shot that kind of hurt them. That again, if Chicago would have said, "Yeah, we'll take 82% of the TV money," I think they'd have had him. And I think maybe who knows what it would have been. It could have been a lot different. History could have been a lot different in 75.
Well, so a couple of things. So television, right? The lack of it, at least on the national level, certainly didn't help. Is it fair to say that national coverage generally also waned? Maybe because of the lack of another television contract and, of course, the shenanigans that happened the year before. It almost feels to me like this 75 was almost, as a juxtaposed, right, to the bombastic, and gigantic flame out, I guess, almost feels completely different in 75, where, albeit better run and a better plan, it almost felt like there was a lack of publicity or it almost felt like it was being somewhat ignored, either because of 74 or just because people had given up where, they could have used a little bit more publicity, et cetera. It just seems like it felt like it was being abandoned, so to speak, by the sports media and or maybe perhaps the fans too.
Oh, yeah. The media coverage, trying to find articles in 75 were really a lot tougher. The Sporting News completely ended their coverage of it. They had the box scores and they had a a column by Charlie Vincent every week in the Sporting News in '74. And in '75, they had nothing. They had the first picture from when they started back. They had one in the spring, a little bit of talking about the league starting up again. The next mention of it really was when they folded. They had a picture of Marshall Taylor, the coach of Shreveport, with Richmond Flowers, one of his players sitting there with their hands in their heads in their hands, and they react to the league folding, and they had no coverage there. The coverage in the cities had depended. San Antonio's was pretty good, but a lot of the bigger markets, they fell off. Their coverage really did wane. I mean, you were right about that. It's tougher to find articles in '75 that dealt with the league unless it was a team like Memphis, which really both newspapers in Memphis carried a lot of coverage on the South End / Grizzlies. But in San Antonio, because that was really the only game in town. But a lot of the teams, a lot of the local press just kind of ignored them. And, the TV coverage, like you said, it was not a national package. It was just local. And the great story from '75 is when the Bell were playing out in Southern California in Anaheim. And the game was like a 58-39. It was lasting quite a while because there was so much scoring. And at I think it was 1 o'clock in the morning Philadelphia time, the TV station that was carrying the game back to Philadelphia played the national anthem and signed off with 10 minutes still left in the game. So, they obviously, they said, well, we have prior commitments, and the prior commitment was playing the national anthem and signing off. And people didn't get to see the last 10 minutes of the game. And, that kind of sums up that lack of, okay, yeah, whatever. We've got the Phillies, we've got the Eagles, we've got the, Flyers here in Philadelphia. We don't need this team. And we're just going to, kind of not treat them as we did when it started. Again, you make a good point, because in '74 it was kind of flashy, kind of a crazier kind of an attitude. We're going to, have a new look to the game, and we're going to have, and that kind of thing. And then '75 was kind of tame, where it was more austere, whereas the budgets, and that kind of thing. And then that kind of really didn't make it an exciting product, because, you had to play was okay, but, you didn't have the fans, you didn't have the press, you didn't have the publicity that you did in '74. Even though it was negative, it was still, there was a lot of craziness going on that you didn't have in '75. So I don't know if, the plan was good in one way, but maybe not in another.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum. And Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those two, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. All right, so let's round the curve here, because you've been wonderful with your time, and I appreciate it. So how does 75 basically end? The wins become the first casualty, right? They're deemed, I guess, by the league offices for whatever reason not being able to meet their capitalization requirements, and that team folds a couple of weeks into the season. But maybe you can give a sense of sort of how the rest of it all sort of played out, right? Because the league itself didn't make it to the end zone, did it?
No, it did not. I mean, Chicago lasted about 4 weeks. They had 2 home games, and I think they averaged something around 3,000 or 4,000, and that's in Soldier Field, which is huge, which makes them even look smaller. So, they just said, we don't have the money. The owners were pulling out. We don't have the money to do it. They weren't going to prop them up again this year like they did in 74. They said, you're gone. So they were folded. San Antonio, again, didn't do very well. The crowds just weren't there. Portland wasn't doing well. The Hawaiians, Southern California did not have the crowds anywhere near they did in 74 at the Big A. Philadelphia, they were awful in Franklin Field. They averaged around four figures probably for the season, somewhere around like 1,500 at some point. Jacksonville was the same. I mean, they had started out great in 74, and they got down to 10, 15,000. Shreveport, their crowds kind of stayed around 20,000. They weren't doing too bad. Birmingham wasn't doing bad. Memphis wasn't doing bad. So those were the 3 that were kind of still hanging in there. But toward the end, around the middle of October, they said, we've got to vote on this. Several teams voted to continue to play. I think it was like San Antonio, Charlotte, who weren't doing too bad. It was mostly some of the small markets. The bigger ones, they said, no, we've had enough. We've dumped enough money into a big hole, and we're not going to do it anymore. And they voted. They voted not to continue to play, and they announced on October 22nd of 75, a major came out and said that, no, we've given up the ghost, and that's the end of it. And so that was pretty much the end. It was in October. They voted not to play. They had enough. The crowds weren't there. The press wasn't there. The public wasn't there. And they finally saw it as a losing proposition.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, though, right, it wasn't completely a lost cause, right? Because there are a lot of things that sort of emanated from that league, right? Whether it be in terms of players and coaches that went on to very interesting and successful careers afterwards, but also some of the innovations and some of the original challenges that sort of led to things down the road, albeit perhaps earlier than its time. But maybe we can kind of just sort of maybe put a nice halo, an ending halo to all this about sort of some of the things that the WFL, aside from the wackiness and the craziness and the trail of debts, that were positive, sort of in a legacy kind of manner, whether it be individuals or some of the contributions, shall we say, to the game as time went on. You want to kind of speak on a couple of those items?
Well, yeah, as I touched on earlier, when they adopted a lot of their rules at the beginning of the season, the NFL went ahead and adopted a lot of the same rules, changed their game quite a bit, starting in 74. You're absolutely right. You had a ton of players from the WFL that had not played previously that went right into the NFL. You had Danny White, who went in. Pat Hayden had a pretty good career there with the Rams. Danny White had a long career, obviously, with the Cowboys. You had quite a few. You had Steve Foley, who played for Denver in the defensive backfield for years, wound up setting the team record for interceptions. So you had a lot of players that came in, and again, that Thursday night football game. The NFL wound up having that for years there. For a while, they had Thursday night football. So there was a lot of things that came out of the WFL, and a lot of the players then got compensated a lot better after the WFL, even after it folded, because starting with that, they had that where they had to start raising salaries because they had a rival coming in here, and players like Merlin Olsen said, we had, even though I had an offer from the WFL, I stayed because the Rams, raised my pay, and they raised salaries. They introduced a lot of, different coaches and owners to pro football, like Bassett, who went on to the USFL. And Sam Battistone, who went to the New Orleans Jazz, even though it's a basketball team, but he was, he was still involved in sports down the road. The uniforms, some of the leagues that came about had more, and now the NFL has even more, more colors in their uniforms now that they did before. The uniforms were kind of bland before that. It took a little while, but they did. They kind of jazzed up their uniforms a little bit more.
Wasn't there even?
And they went into markets.
Wasn't there even some experimentation with the color of the pants by position for some of these teams?
I was wondering when you're going to get around to that. Yes, the famous color-coded pants that they tried in '75. Somebody came up with this great idea that every position would have their own colored pants. They had offensive linemen were green, quarterbacks were white with stars on them, wide receivers were orange. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how they went, but every position, it was supposedly to help not the real, the fanatical fan, but the kind of the everyday fan that's kind of just tuning in to get used to, to kind of get used to football, to kind of understand, and kind of educate them. And it just backfired because none of the players wanted to wear them. The players didn't like them because if they saw orange pants going past them, and they were wearing orange pants because they were a defensive back and they're used to that, they let the player go, and here either a rival, an opponent in an orange pants. So it was kind of confusing for the players. They didn't want to wear them. I think Vince Papali from the Bell said they look like the guards over in England with these weird-looking. And I've seen the video of it. It's just, they had that idea. Then they also had an idea of field goals being certain different, 3, 2, or 1 points depending on how close they were. So that didn't work out. And they had the Dickerod in '74 that didn't work out. It was like trying to replace the chains. Yeah, yes, the color-coded pants.
Yeah, but give us a quick. Yeah. You mentioned the Dickerod, right? So, what was that, and what is that, and do you have any idea where the name came from? And tell our fans what the Dickerod was or is.
Well, I always wondered what the Dickerod name, but it was a guy named George Dicker, Dicker, who invented it, and they called it the Dickerod. It was one pole that they would lay down where the first down was, where they had started. They would lay it down, and then wherever the ball was, that would mark where the ball was. But they had a thing that slid on the pole that didn't work all the time. It didn't quite meet up to the expectations they had for it. They thought it was going to be something easier, but it wasn't. So they wound up in '75 going back to the chains. But yeah, the Dickerod was something that it was just one pole. They lay down one end on where they had started, lay it over. Was it 10 yards or not? And they had these things that slid on the pole, and it didn't work. They jammed up and everything, and it was more ridicule than an innovation than anything. So,
it was an attempt, I guess, to give sort of the viewers, I guess, that were actually watching these games, a more visual sense of where how much yardage was left to go in a classic 1st and 10 kind of approach, right? So we see today with the pylons and the sort of, but it's just interesting to see sort of the mechanics of this thing, and that sort of being a quote unquote piece of legacy, if you will, from the league.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, the Dick Rod was one of those that one of those ideas that seemed like a good idea at the time, just didn't seem to pan out.
It also
just like the color-coded pants.
Yeah, it's also interesting too that I think people kind of forget that the goalposts, right, in the NFL, right until 1973, were actually at the goal line, right? So the WFL, and I guess the rules were going to be changed for the 1974 NFL season, but the WFL actually was the first, because of the date of its schedule, the first league to actually professionally put goalposts in the back of the end zone. I think many people kind of forget that prior to that we were looking at bumping into the goalposts actually in the end zone before that.
Well, yeah. I mean, you see a lot of videos from the old NFL where you see these guys smacking into the goalpost there on the goal line, or they had a goal line play and a guy would jump over the pile and smack right into the goalpost. So they finally. Yeah, I think one of the reasons it came about, besides the fact it was a very dangerous practice, was that the NFL had become a big kicker league where there was kickers that, because of the fact it was a shorter distance, it was easier for them to kick field goals. There was a lot more, they get down so far and then they would just say, okay, we'll just kick a field goal. And kickers have become very prevalent in the NFL. The WFL didn't want that. The WFL wanted more offense in terms of like touchdowns. They didn't want the extra point. They had the action point again. So, yeah, they moved them to the back. They were the first ones to do that. And, I think it helped the kickers, depending on how you look at it, whether the kickers were bad or they just didn't make a lot of field goals. The kickers didn't do a very good job in 74. And I don't know if it was because the kickers were just bad or it was because of the fact they were kicking, a longer field goal. But, I think that was one of the reasons they did it, because the NFL had become so, prevalent with field goals and kicking, and they wanted to kind of open up the offense a little bit. And that was one of, the league founders, including Davidson's ideas, was to kind of, put some more offense in.
All right, last question. Given your deep dive into the history of this league and continuing so, what lessons have you learned from this process, and what did you think you knew about the league before you went into this exercise that changed in the process of putting these stories and these books together, coming out of it?
Well, I think you can easily look at it and kind of ridicule it a lot, and I think at your first glance, anybody's going to do that. I think I even did that. It was kind of, all the stories, but then you look deeper, you look at the human interest story, you look at the fact that the WFL had the first black head coach in pro football since the 1920s with Willie Wood at Philadelphia. Everybody thinks it's Art Shell in Oakland back in the 90s, or 80s. I'm not sure when he came in, but it was actually Willie Wood who was the coach of the Philadelphia Bell. You had that. You had black ownership in the WFL, which you did not have any in the NFL at the time. You had Detroit, even though they, again, weren't very wise in running a team. You had owners like Marvin Gaye, like Esther Edwards. You had several other black owners there at Detroit. You had Rami Loud down in Orlando, who was a black owner down there. He had a black general manager. So you had a lot more, and you had a lot more black quarterbacks at the time in the WFL than you did in the NFL. I think it was probably triple the number of black quarterbacks. The NFL, I think, only had like half a dozen, if that, while the WFL had closer to 10, 12, black quarterbacks in it. So they were a lot more colorblind, I think, in the ways of ownership and players and coaches. There were more black assistant coaches in the WFL. It was just the idea that, there was a lot of these stories that I think get swept under the rug that really shouldn't, because of the fact if you take one, the first glance, oh man, this league was nuts, it was crazy. I mean, yes, that's interesting, but to look past that, to look past the innovations that they made, that the NFL picked up, that the USFL picked up, that other football picked up, and the trendsetters that they had with in minority hiring and that kind of thing, and the rules changes that other leagues adopted, you really have to look at it as a, did they make inroads that maybe would not have been there if they hadn't existed? Would the NFL have made those changes if the WFL had not been there? I don't know if they would have or not. I really don't. I think they were happy with the game they had. I don't think they would have opened it up like they did if the WFL hadn't been there. I think that kind of part of the story really gets lost in the craziness, the zaniness of some of the stories that, you can kind of chuckle at, you kind of look at and say, boy, that was crazy. Whereas if you look deep enough and you look down at some of the documentation and some of the books, and some of the things that were written, you got to look at some of the innovations, some of the trends that they started that were picked up again by the the NFL and the USFL, and it still survived to this day.
Do you think that the economy in the United States at that time, which was not great, recession for sure, and the lack of consistent television and or perhaps the non-existence really of any great scale of cable television, although I do think HBO, a fledgling HBO, had a number of games on their air, but obviously a much, much smaller base of viewers. Do you think the absence of, you mentioned holding on, quote unquote, was the timing also, in the stars, so to speak, in terms of not being fertile ground, or is that just a convenient excuse in retrospect?
Oh, no, I think that's a very very good point. I think it's something that you have to consider. The economy at that time was awful. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, that's one thing Davidson looks back on and says, we started at exactly the wrong time when that, the stagflation, they called it was stagnant. The Dow Jones was awful. It was tanking. Nobody was there. There was nobody with any cash. Davidson said that in his interview. That nobody was out there with a lot of cash to put into to commit to a football team or a sports franchise, and you didn't have that then. And I think it's a valid point. I really think it's not an excuse. I think it's more of a valid point that this was part of why they didn't make it as well as people just didn't have luxury money hanging around, extra cash that they could spend on things like football games or something like that. And yes, you didn't have the proliferation of sports channels and sports networks and that kind of thing. Cable was really kind of just starting out. Yes, you are right. HBO did carry a few of the games. I have not been able to track down any. They probably taped over them at the time anyway, or they never kept any tape of them at the time. But they were on TBS, which again, the three big networks were not going to carry them. ESPN was a few years down the line. ESPN would have been great for the WFL if they'd have been in existence at that time, just like they were with the USFL. USFL was helped tremendously by the ESPN coverage, and which led to ABC, which carried the Sunday game. That helped them tremendously. I think that not having that big TV presence to be able to have something that was really a lot more substantial definitely hurt them. And I don't think I really have never considered that an excuse. I really think that's a valid point, that the economy had to play a part in the ultimate demise of the WFL, that they just did not have the money available either for ownership or for people to go out and spend money when you've got lines at the gas station and that kind of thing. And it just, it was just not a good time for a startup sports league and a sports endeavor.
Well, look, the World Football League, right, only existed for really a year and a half, right? And there is so much more still to unpack about this league, the teams involved, and I hope we have another chance. I strongly urge us to have another opportunity to talk further, because there's probably so many things that I got a whole pile of notes here that we didn't even get to. I mean, Larry King, right, calling the games for the Shreveport Steamer,
right?
There's so many just crazy little sort of anecdotes and stuff. But as a prelude, hopefully, to that opportunity, why don't you remind our audience the three books that you're part of that are dedicated to some aspect of this league. And you also hinted at something that you're putting together now, a fourth one. So here's your promotional opportunity. Why don't you give us the names and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, like I said, the first one was the WFL Encyclopedia with Todd Mayer and myself. We both worked on it. It's more of a statistical history of the league. There's a little bit of blurb about each team, but it really doesn't go in depth. But it's a very good statistical repository for the league that has never existed before. It's something that really needed to be done, in my opinion. It's, again, St. Johann Press, still in print. Then the next one after that, I had an idea for the Blazers, the Florida Blazers from '74, which, again, I thought was a tremendous story that needed telling. A Dollar Short was the name of that book. Again, it came out very well. Had some interviews with some of the players, which were very enlightening to me, which really added a lot to the book, a lot of behind-the-scenes stories. It went beyond game accounts and statistics and that kind of thing to what it is actually like to be there. The next book I came out with was WIFFLE, which was kind of on the history of every team in the league. Quite an undertaking, but because I'd done all this, it was, to me, was the next step, and I thought it came out very well. Has been well received, as had the first two, and now the next one coming out is going to be called Nothing More Than a Brand New Set of Flat Tires, which is about the Detroit Wheels. It was a quote that Arthur Richmond came up with in August of '74 to describe the Detroit team. Again, a lot of great background stories, a lot of great recollections from the players that, you didn't know some of the stuff. It gives you more of a human interest feel to it that goes beyond the game, that goes beyond the field product or what they had to put up with not getting paid, with dealing with, lack of equipment, basic facilities. It was a great story. Again, it'll probably be coming out sometime this year, again, through St. Johann Press, and that'll be my fourth one. Not sure if I'm going to have any more on the WFL. But never know. There's a lot of stories to tell.
All right. Well, no doubt about that. So let's put a Post-it note on the wall for, I hope, if you're inclined, a few more conversations, maybe one specifically on the Blazers and that book. And then, of course, when the Wheels book comes out, that story as well, if you'll have us.
Oh, I'd be happy to talk to you. If you have me to talk and run my mouth for a while on the WFL, I'm happy to do it. I love talking about it. I think it's something that should be told and should be documented and should be out there that people should be familiar with and get to know.
Well, we do too, and hopefully we'll sell a couple of your current books in the process, so give us a chance to do some of that, and we look forward to future conversations with Mark Speck. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing, and what a crazy league, amazing stories, and literally I think we've just scratched the surface, but I appreciate you allowing us to do just that for a couple hours.
And I appreciate you having me on your show, Tim. Very, very happy to be here and very happy to tell the story and let these stories go out there to fans that may not have heard about them.
As they say, truth is stranger than fiction, and there's no more perfect evidence of that little phrase than the World Football League, right? Mark Speck, an amazing two-part conversation. We will have Mark back. There are just too many other items and too many other topics to discuss about this amazing curiosity known as the WFL. Let's remind you, as a primer to our next conversations with Mark, your homework assignments are the following books. Please go find them wherever fine books are sold. All of these are published by St. Johann Press. You can also find links to all of these books that I'm about to read to you on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for episodes numbers 51 and 52, and you will find links to all of these books. And I encourage you to read them all and memorize all of them before our next episode on the WFL. The first book is called the World Football League Encyclopedia. That is the Bible. It is co-written by Mark Speck and Todd Mayer, and that is available for purchase. You can also find WIFFLE, his current book, WIFFLE, the wild, zany, and sometimes hilarious true story of the World Football League. That is available for purchase. And of course, the book that we'd love to spend some extra time on in a future episode the story of the Florida Blazers. The title of that book is called "And a Dollar Short: The Empty Promises, Broken Dreams, and Somewhat-Less-Than-Comic Misadventures of the 1974 Florida Blazers." That is also available for purchase. Again, you can find links to all those books at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Again, just look for the episodes numbers 51 and 52. Let's see. Before we say goodbye, we want to say hello to our friends at Podfly Productions. That's David Gregerson, Corey Coates, Dr. Jerry Payne, and Eric Begay, and podfly.net. That's the place you want to go to find out more about Podfly and how they can help you, too, get into the podcasting business. What a fun and amazing journey this has been. Podfly has been there just about every step of the way for me. And if you recommend, I highly recommend them. If you think you know what you're doing or you don't, and you're interested in the whole idea of podcasting, give them a look and tell them that we sent you. Okay, I think they'll treat you extra special nicely, and we appreciate their efforts and hopefully continued in the months and weeks to come. All right, I'm done for this week's episode. Thank you so much for giving us a listen. You want to follow us on social media? By all means, do so. Find us at Good Seats Still on Twitter. Find us at Good Seats Still Available on Instagram. You can look us up on Facebook. And again, if you want to send us some email or otherwise converse with us, our website again, for the love of God, please visit early and often. It's goodseatsstillavailable.com. One last thing, don't forget, please, to rate and review us wherever you can, Apple iTunes or the Apple Podcast place, wherever that is, or any other place, for God's sakes, wherever you're listening. Just give us a rating and review, some stars, tell us how we're doing, and that helps our algorithm. We get discovered a lot more easily, and it also recommends the show to others like you who might be interested in these crazy topics. All right, until next week, we appreciate your listening again, and take care of yourselves. Drive safely, as they say, and we'll see you next week.